When I was 12, my father embezzled project funds and fled, leaving my mother and me to face the community's wrath. 22 years later, I found my father and prepared to kill him. I remember in 1996, my father stood under the willow tree waiting for me after school. From afar, he waved his large hand like a flag in the air. "Son, over here." He looked imposing, his voice booming, like a victorious general. That year, my father led a construction team of laid-off workers and, after 3 years of barely making ends meet, received a major project for the first time. The city funded the construction of a 27-story glass building, an almost unattainable Babel Tower in our small town. When construction started, local leaders attended. There was a convoy, and offerings of pig heads and chicken blood were made. The streets were filled with colorful flags. Firecrackers went off, and smoke filled every street in the town. Despite the grand spectacle, the building's fate was sealed. It stalled at the 12th floor. People's dreams of reaching the sky vanished, and the instigator was my father. But that's a later story. At that moment, I was running towards my father under the willow tree with a group of greedy friends, watching him magically pull out several bags of spicy strips from his briefcase. We devoured them, our hands covered in red oil, and Jolin even forgot to hide the birthmark on his cheek, enthusiastically saying to me, "Fangency, I envy you so much. Your dad is awesome." Of course my dad is great. With those words, I strutted home, proudly waving my red-stained hands, only to feel a shiver of fear when I saw my mother's face, black as the bottom of a pot. "Dinner is ready. You're eating this junk again." My father grinned, shielding me behind him, and said his usual line, "Don't be so harsh. As long as the kid is happy." In my memory, my mother and father were completely different people. They met when my father took a knife to his arm to help my mother retrieve her stolen purse. What was just a moment of heroism for my father turned into a lifelong commitment for my mother, who was stubborn and unyielding. So, my father's later laziness, selfishness, and slyness were all ignored by my mother. She still treated my father as a hero, let this man from another place move into her home, and willingly cooked and cleaned for him. But my mother's willing sacrifices were met with the filthy stench my father brought back from the gambling table and the cheap perfume from the women he entangled with. I felt sorry for my mother's tears, but also liked the sound of the wind that followed them late at night. The muffled breathing, the warmth that rose even through the walls, were proof to me then that life could go on as usual. So at 12, when the sound of tenderness turned into the sounds of a beastly fight, I had a vague premonition of the coming storm. The day it happened, Jolin and I skipped school to see a circus that was briefly in town. By the time I got home, it was late. The door was wide open, and loud noises spilled out from the brightly lit house. Startled, I thought my truancy had been discovered. Trembling, I walked to the door, bumping into Jolin's father. He grabbed my arm, and I thought he was going to ask about Jolin. I quickly said, "Uncle, Jolin is already home. Please don't hit him." Skipping school was my idea. Before I finished, he interrupted angrily. "Where is your father? Where did he hide? Do you know?" He shook me back and forth in his urgency, my shoulder blades hurting as if they would be crushed. My mother rushed out of the door, yanked me into her arms, her actions fierce but her voice pleading, "Old Joe, it's late. Go home. I'll figure something out, okay?" Dazed, I followed my mother inside, looked around at the mess, and realized my father was nowhere to be seen. I didn't know exactly what had happened, but the fulfillment of my premonition filled me with dread. "Mom, where is Dad?" My mother didn't answer. "Go to bed. You have school tomorrow." She tried to hide the truth, but the town was small. I soon learned everything from Jolin. As dusk fell after school, I heard Jolin calling me from behind. I responded, but as soon as I turned around, I was kicked to the ground. Lying on my back, unable to react, another punch struck my cheek. The birthmark on Jolin's cheek appeared even darker with his anger as he looked down at me, almost gritting his teeth. My dad said he would take me to get rid of this birthmark once he got paid. I've been waiting for 2 years, and now it's all for nothing. It's all because of your dad. Why should he take all the money for himself? Shameless bastard. You're his son. You're just like him. Though incoherent, I understood. My father hadn't paid nearly 2 years' worth of wages, and when the first batch of project funds came in, he chose to embezzle it and flee. The nearly 50,000 yuan in unpaid wages were essential for several families' livelihoods. Zhoulin's hoped to remove his birthmark and the medical expenses to sustain relatives' lives. Curled up on the ground, I felt more fists and kicks raining down on me. These beatings, venting the anger of their parents, were only interrupted long after by a teacher's whistle. Bruised all over, I limped home. My mother hugged me, crying, and said, "Don't blame them. We owe them money. It's fair that they hit you. I know it's your dad's debt, but we are still a family. We have to repay it and have a clear conscience." She choked on her words, her tone filled with a naive hope. As long as we pay it back, our days will return to normal. Everything will be like before. But how could we repay it? In 2000, nearly 50,000 yuan was a debt that could crush most working-class families. I looked up at my mother, wanting to say, "Let's not pay it back, let's run away too." But my mother was stubborn. She wouldn't listen to me. She would only let her tears silently fall into my wounds. The moment of pain felt like a sharp blade skinning me. So for 3 years of middle school, I endured, becoming a punching bag for the anger directed at my father. My mother worked hard from dawn to dusk, but even then, she found that the money she earned couldn't cover the debt. She slept all day and, at dusk, dressed up and left with a seductive scent. In the first year of high school, my mother paid off the debt. She washed away the cheap perfume, cooked a table full of dishes to celebrate, and gave me a pair of new sneakers. I cautiously asked, "So they won't resent me anymore?" My mother nodded, smiling as if it was obvious. But the next day, the cold taunts that had lasted for 3 years didn't stop. During break, Zhoulin caught up and slapped the back of my head, then looked at my shoes. Wow, new shoes? Even a debtor's son dares to wear new shoes. Several feet stomped on the clean white sneakers in unison. They laughed as they walked away, leaving me confused. Don't you know? My mother has already paid off the debt. The people ahead didn't react. I raised my voice. Zhoulin, my mother has paid off the debt. We don't owe you any money anymore. Zhoulin stopped in his tracks, turned, and faced me with the side of his face marked by the birthmark. So what? I stood there, stunned. What? No one answered. They continued to walk away, indifferent. They still resented me. Why? It shouldn't be like this. My mother said that once the debt was paid, everything would return to normal. I heard something collapse in my heart. Desperately, I grabbed Zhoulin's arm and shook it frantically. Zhoulin, are you deaf? I said, my mother has paid off the debt. It's all paid off, completely paid off. We don't owe you anything anymore. You have no reason to keep resenting me. Everything should be like before, just like before. My mother said so. Impatiently, Zhoulin shook off my hand. Say what? Your mom's a whore, your dad's a crook. What can you be? My dad said that even if the money is paid back, your family will never change. As his words fell, I suddenly remembered what my mother once said. We owe them money. It's fair that they hit you. So what about now? As the crowd dispersed, I stood there, seeing my equally shocked mother. She stood at the edge of the playground, holding the coat she brought because of the cooling weather. The coat was brightly colored, but my mother's face was ashen, her eyes filled with the despair of being cornered, powerless to fight back. That night, my mother jumped into the river. 7 days later, her bloated, gray-white body was found miles away from town. The body was dragged ashore, facing the sunlight, pockets filled with stones. After my mother's funeral, I went home with my aunt. She lived in an old apartment building on the outskirts of the city, near the river. The walls were peeling, the neighborhood was dirty, pigeons circled the rooftops, and each building even had a main power switch. I looked around the neighborhood, and the people in the neighborhood looked at me. Their searchlight-like gazes made me lower my head and quicken my pace. Finally, I entered the building, only to encounter my aunt's acquaintance. My aunt called her Teacher Chin. Having probably heard my story from my aunt, Teacher Chin looked at me with a pitiful expression on her aged face, her eyes shimmering with a misguided sense of empathy. She pushed a bag of oranges into my arms, and despite my aunt's polite refusals, Teacher Chin swiftly stuffed 2 oranges into my pockets. They exchanged polite refusals until they were outside the corridor. Standing there, I couldn't help but think, could these heavy oranges drag me down to the riverbed like my mother? My aunt's voice broke my morbid thoughts. I came back to my senses and followed her home, sharing a room with my cousin, Chung Shunhai. Shunhai, who was in his first year of middle school, seemed lonely as an only child. He was unusually welcoming to my arrival. He seized every opportunity to chat with me. But the school anecdotes and supernatural stories from forums annoyed me. My mind was consumed with the haunting image of my mother's gray, swollen corpse. I spent the whole semester in solitude, occasionally running into Teacher Chin, who was always alone. Whenever she saw me, she would look at me with pity and push an orange into my arms. Teacher Chin's pitying expression irritated me, but every time I took the orange and thanked her, the warmth in her eyes made me look forward to our next meeting despite myself. But why did Teacher Chin look at a stranger like me with such gentle eyes? I never quite understood until one evening after self-study, when I ran into her downstairs again. Her shopping bag had ripped, and oranges were rolling everywhere. I stepped forward to help Teacher Chin pick them up and used my school uniform jacket to hold the oranges. As I carried the heavy oranges upstairs, I couldn't help but ask, Teacher Chin, why do you like oranges so much? I don't like oranges, Xiaomin does. She turned to me. Xiaomin is my granddaughter. She was a very good child. She never cried or fussed. Even if she was occasionally upset, if you peeled an orange for her, she'd be smiling again. That child always smiled, like the little sun on a spring morning. Even the moment before she fell from the windowsill, she waved at me, smiling and calling out, "Grandma, did you buy oranges?" I bought them, but I shouldn't have gone out to buy them. I shouldn't have left her alone at home, hoping she'd be okay. Teacher Chin stopped at the stairwell landing. I felt awkward, wondering if I should offer condolences, but Teacher Chin continued walking as if nothing had happened. I followed her into her apartment and immediately noticed a portrait directly facing the entrance. It was of a girl around 6 years old, with a round face, a button nose, and a small beauty mark on her forehead. The most striking feature was her eyes. They were slightly narrow with upturned corners. They were the same as mine, the fox-like eyes that carried a hint of charm. Teacher Chin turned to look at my eyes. Her gaze remained gentle, and her voice carried a rasp I couldn't understand. If Xiaomin were still here, she'd be about your height now. My heart felt like it had been struck by a drumstick. I suddenly understood that the oranges Teacher Chin gave me weren't meant for me, and the warmth in her eyes had never belonged to me. Out of spite, I threw the oranges on the ground. For a long time after that, I avoided Teacher Chin. During the summer vacation, I planned to escape Chung Xuanhai's enthusiasm by walking along the river every day under the scorching sun, only to find he was engrossed in a new comic book. It was a collector's edition of Slam Dunk, which must have been expensive. I thought as much, and indeed found confirmation one night. The light was on in my aunt's room. After using the bathroom, I quietly passed by and overheard a conversation inside. A low, uncertain voice was speaking. It was my uncle. Isn't it unfair to only buy things for Hai? After all, we sold his mother's house. My aunt, irritated, replied, "What's unfair about it? Look at how much we're spending on Fanjansi's food, clothes, and everything else. If he wants to go to college and then graduate school, we'll have to pay for that too. We're doing enough by supporting him. He's unlucky to have those parents. It's his fate." I took a deep breath and stomped my feet loudly as I walked past. The room fell silent for a moment, and then I faintly heard my uncle's reproach. "How can you talk like that? She was your sister." Back in the room, Chung Shunhai was still engrossed in his comic book under the lamp. I looked around his bed and noticed that, besides the comics, he had acquired many new things. These items, glittering with a sheen of luxury among the otherwise shabby furnishings, stung my eyes. Mom always said that karma is like sowing seeds. You reap what you sow. But if that were true, why did Mom, who sacrificed everything to repay Dad's debts out of kindness, end up being driven to suicide? And why was I, abandoned by my parents and having my home sold by my aunt to be exchanged for treasures my cousin never dreamed of, dismissed with a casual, "It's his bad luck to have those parents"? Shunhai noticed my gaze and, thinking I wanted to read the comic, he hesitated for a moment. Though reluctant, he finally pulled out the first volume and handed it to me, solemnly advising, "It's very expensive. Be careful when you turn the pages, don't crease them, and make sure your hands are dry." His lengthy instructions were like a catalyst for my anger. I took several deep breaths, but couldn't quell the fire in my chest. Finally, I lost control and tore the brand new comic in half. Shunhai was stunned for a couple of seconds, then he screamed and lunged at me. I sidestepped, grabbed the entire set of comics from the table, and tore them apart in a frenzy. With my blood boiling and my ears filled with the incessant chant of unfair, I was completely consumed by rage. When I came to my senses, I had Shunhai by the throat, half his body hanging out the window. His face was dark with fear, eyes wide, emitting pitiful cries like a lamb being slaughtered, which only fueled my anger further. "Do you know why you, in this rundown home, have these things only rich kids have?" Behind me, I could hear my aunt's concerned knocking and questions, but I ignored her, glaring at my cousin. "You have these because your mom sold my home, because I became an orphan, because my mom died, leaving me to jump into the river." Jumping into the river. These words sound ordinary and cliched, don't they? But have you ever seen a body that's been underwater for 7 days? Gray, swollen flesh, unrecognizable features, my mom, but at first sight, all I could do was vomit, not cry. Have you experienced that? Have you seen the heavy stones that fell out of my mom's pockets? Heard the police tell you about her determination to die? You haven't been through any of that, yet you dare to tell me to be careful with the pages? My shouting was abruptly interrupted by force, and I collapsed to the ground, realizing the door had been broken open. Shunhai was in his parents' arms, the three of them trembling yet comforting each other, their familial warmth sapping my strength. I stood up, ignoring my aunt's attempts to stop me, and ran out into the darkness. As I descended the stairs, I faintly heard Qin Laosher calling my name. I didn't turn back or stop. Instead, I quickened my pace, running past streetlights until I was drenched in sweat and collapsed by the riverbank. After heavy breaths, an overwhelming silence filled the air, suffocating and penetrating deep into my bones. I gazed dazedly at the moon hidden behind clouds, feeling an intense surge of longing and loneliness. I covered my eyes with my hand, and for the first time since my mother's funeral 93 days ago, I broke down in tears. I wanted to see my mom again so badly. Not the swollen, unrecognizable corpse by the river, but the mom who raised and loved me. Suddenly, I remembered a story my cousin once told. He said that if you kowtow in all 4 directions at a crossroads at midnight, you could connect with the spirit world and see the dead. What I once scoffed at now seemed like my only hope. I found a crossroads and knelt down. As I kowtowed in each direction, the world around me fell silent. No cars sped by, and not a single living creature was in sight. The summer wind turned cold, making my hair stand on end and my heart feel as if a block of ice had been lodged in it. After finishing my kowtows, a gust of wind blew through, and a blurry figure appeared in the dim edge of a streetlight. The figure walked slowly towards me. I knew it might be my mom, yet I was terrified. I fought the urge to run. "Mom." The figure stepped into the light. It was Qin Laosher. The fear ebbed away, replaced by a chill as cold sweat on my back was blown by the wind. What was she doing here so late? Qin Laosher, perhaps sensing my confusion, spoke up. "Just taking a walk. Old people don't sleep much." She approached me. "Kneeling like this won't work. You won't see any ghosts." "Why not? What do you know?" "I know because I've tried. After Xiaomin fell from the window, I tried every way I could think of to see her ghost." Qin Laosher brushed the dust from my knees. "Xiaomin again." I felt an intense irritation. I wanted to avoid her hand, but when I lowered my gaze, I unexpectedly met her eyes and saw the relentless sadness and longing within them. Qin Laosher said, "But I do know a way to see the spirit of a loved one. Would you like to try?" The sorrow in her eyes made me obediently follow her to sit by the riverbank. We sat in silence at first, until the sky began to lighten. Qin Laosher suddenly spoke, her words a mix of confession and comfort. For a long time after Xiaomin's death, I kept questioning the heavens, asking why, having done no evil, such a disaster befell me. I cursed everything and harbored resentment toward everything. As a teacher, I ironically held onto feudal superstitions just to keep going. Until I had a dream. In the dream, Xiaomin stood in a river, saying she was going to a new world. I cried and told her I couldn't bear to let her go, begged her not to leave. She waited over and hugged me, saying it was all right. She would always remember my love and would always love me. She would leave pieces of her soul behind in this world, in the reflections on the river at sunrise. As she finished, the light from behind the mountains hit the river, making it shimmer like a piece of translucent jade. She glanced at me, constantly questioning the fairness of fate is pointless. Instead of being trapped in it, find something that gives you hope to keep living, even if it's just the sparkle of light on the river. The shimmering light on the river brought tears to my eyes. I understood the deep comfort in Qin Laosher's words. But the unextinguished fire in my heart drove me to question. Qin Laosher, if that's true, why did my mom, for something so meaningless, resolutely leave me to die? For me, hope was the most useless thing. I would never forget how, after paying off the debts, my mom finally had a glimmer of hope, only to have it crushed by a single thoughtless remark from Zhou Lin. Hope is not important at all. It's the smallest thing that can be easily swallowed up by unfairness. So, I just want fairness. Qin Laosher looked up, staring at me in shock for a long time. She was the first to avert her gaze, then she sighed deeply, her tears falling into the shadow cast by the moving light, filled with an incomprehensible pain. Her hand reached for my head. I wanted to avoid it, but the rare warmth of her palm made me reluctant to move away. Don't think that way. If you do, life will be very hard for you. Qin Laosher's eyes lowered, her gaze shimmering with a premonition of my future. Life will be very hard for you, my Xiaomin. When I returned to my aunt's house, the door was wide open, and the place was silent except for Qing Shanhai, who was sleeping soundly on the dining table. His breathing was steady, clearly dreaming. As I approached quietly, I noticed the bruises on his neck, remnants of my previous grip. Guilt spread through me, and I regretted listening to Qin Laosher's advice to come back. I wanted to turn and flee quickly, but accidentally knocked over a tin box on the table, the sound waking Qing Shanhai from his sleep. Panicking, I bent to pick it up and saw that the box contained a comic book taped together and a card with a crayon-written "sorry" inside. Above me, I heard rustling, followed by Qing Shanhai's tentative voice. "Brother, I'm sorry. My mom didn't tell me about Auntie." Even though I was the one who acted out, he was the one apologizing carefully. My nose tingled, and my eyes welled up. I stood up, wanting to speak. But the memory of last night seemed to have left a shadow on Qing Shanhai. At my slightest movement, he flinched and stammered. "Brother, my mom and dad were out looking for you all night. Since you're back, I should call them right away." He disappeared behind the door. I felt my heart ache, with an apology stuck in my throat like a fishbone, hard to swallow or spit out. It wasn't until much later, when I saved a mentally broken Qing Shanhai, that I finally turned that lingering pain into a belated apology. But that was 14 years later, far too distant from this moment. Right now, all I felt was guilt and worry about my aunt scolding me. However, no scolding came. For a long time, everyone treated my outburst that night as a dream. No one mentioned it, and no one held a grudge. Not long after the new school term started, during a routine breakfast, my aunt suddenly asked about my whereabouts that night. I stammered as I recounted kneeling at the crossroads to see my mother's spirit. Hearing this, my aunt's eyes reddened, but her mouth was unforgiving. In this modern age, Still believing in those old superstitious ghost stories? You must have read all your books into a dog's stomach. She quickly left, only to return awkwardly with a new pair of shoes. Brand-name shoes, identical to the ones my cousin wore. I looked at them, tears falling onto the new shoes. The ever-present image of the gray, bloated corpse slowly sank into the depths of the river, out of my sight. When I was accepted into a prestigious university, my aunt hosted a modest celebration dinner at a restaurant. The sparse dishes on the round table seemed meager compared to the grand feasts other students' families had. Yet everyone present, from my teachers to the grade head, beamed with pride. Why? I thought it must be because of my achievement. Being the top science student in the province was enough to make this humble feast shine with unmatched brilliance. Sitting at the head of the table, I felt the approving gazes around me and couldn't help but straighten my back with pride. In my sophomore year, my aunt came to the university saying my deadbeat father had contacted her, leaving his details and some money. I refused both, asking my aunt to return them. I didn't know if my aunt returned the money, but shortly after, she suddenly bought an apartment in the city and Shanghai transferred to a prestigious high school. The high school must have been stressful because one day, Shanghai came to me at the university, almost crying, begging me to come home over the weekend and persuade my aunt to let him transfer back to his old school. I agreed and skipped classes to spend the day with him. But when the weekend came, I didn't go home as promised. The unknown whereabouts of the money and my aunt's sudden apartment purchase created a rift in my heart. I stopped going home and began living off scholarships and part-time work, refusing financial help from my aunt and gradually losing contact with her family. After my aunt moved, I visited the old neighborhood more frequently to see Qin Laosher. Qin Laosher was always alone. Seeing me made her as happy as a child. I looked forward to her asking about my life, because then I could proudly tell her that I wasn't living the difficult life she had predicted. Qin Laosher was very old by then. She didn't say much, only raising her hand to touch my head. But her aging hand no longer obeyed her, and the sleeve with lint balls trembled weakly in the air before dropping back to her lap. There was a strange light in Qin Laosher's eyes, a look I couldn't decipher. I thought about buying her a new sweater since her son, who managed her pension, refused to do so. But before I could give her the sweater, my company started massive layoffs and rumors spread that employees over 30 were the first to go. Old employees topping the layoff list? Everyone treated it as a joke. But I couldn't take the chance. So, already in my 30s, I worked overtime to prove my worth, even taking on tasks beyond my responsibility. Yet despite my efforts, I still ended up on the layoff list. Handing back my work badge and stepping out of the building, the sunlight reflecting off the glass stabbed my eyes, making me feel like an orange peel spat out by the company after being chewed up. Through the car window, I saw again the image of my mother's gray, floating corpse. Finding a new job wasn't going well. Either I never heard back after being told to wait for a notification, or the pay and benefits didn't compare to those offered to fresh graduates. The pending mortgage payments and dwindling savings kept me awake at night with anxiety. Unable to sleep, I got up to tidy the house and found the sweater meant for Qin Laosher in the corner of the wardrobe. It had a faint, familiar scent, somewhat like Qin Laosher's. In the midnight solitude, this familiar scent made the memory of her warm hand on my head even more comforting. I realized it had been a long time since I last saw her. Nearly a year later, I took the sweater to the old neighborhood. There was a light on in her apartment, but no one answered the door, and her phone was constantly busy. Could something have happened? Growing anxious, I disregarded propriety and found the spare key under the doormat to open the door. As soon as I opened the door, a nauseating stench hit me, making me retch. I took a few deep breaths outside before mustering the courage to enter. Inside, there was only a dim light to guide me. I walked carefully, afraid of unexpectedly finding Qin Laosher's decomposed body. But when I found her in the bedroom, I thought her current state might be worse than being a decomposed corpse. She was paralyzed in bed, covered with a filthy blanket, lying in her own waste that dripped over the bed's edge. She was emaciated, clinging to life only with the help of an electric respirator. How could she deteriorate so much in just a year? The sight shocked me to the core. I hurried forward to ask questions, to lift the blanket, and clean the source of the stench. But before I could do anything, Jean Lauscher's skeletal hand, moving only 3 fingers, gripped mine tightly like a vice. I couldn't break free, so I gently reassured her. Jean Lauscher, it's me, Fangency. I won't hurt you. I just want to clean up a bit. The look in her eyes stopped my words mid-sentence. What kind of eyes were those? They were filled with sorrow and despair, like the deep, dark sea. But when she heard my name, a faint light of hope appeared, like a plea. A plea for release, a desperate wish for death. I suddenly understood. Jean Lauscher wasn't lying here clinging to life out of fear of death. Someone was trapping her soul. Who? Her son? Why? To keep collecting her pension? The anger rising in me felt like a burning fire. The skeletal hand suddenly released me. I stood up, turned off the bedside lamp, and walked out of the room dominated by darkness and stench, suddenly realizing everything. I turned off the main power switch for the building. I counted the seconds, and at 1,020 seconds, I reached the entrance of the complex and looked back. The building behind me had its lights back on. 1,020 seconds, 17 minutes. 17 minutes without the electric respirator was enough for her soul to break free and fly to freedom. The emptiness from no longer feeling the warmth of Jean Lauscher's hand spread in my heart. I looked back at the single dark window in the building and had a fanciful thought. It felt like a rebellion. Jean Lauscher left me her apartment in the old neighborhood. It was an unexpected gift, laid out in a will she had stored with her lawyer. Transfer her property to Fangency. A pleasant surprise, like a reward after a hard-fought victory. Jean Lauscher's son couldn't accept that the property he thought was his had slipped away to someone else. He contacted me through a lawyer and arranged a meeting. Clearly a trap, but I went willingly. The meeting place was a cafe near the tech park. I squeezed through the crowd and finally found an empty table. Just as I sat down, I felt eyes fixed on me. The gaze came from one of the baristas behind the counter. He had clear, handsome features and a smile at the corner of his lips. His gaze was filled with joy, like seeing an old friend after a long time. A familiar face? His features seemed familiar, a hazy outline in my memory, but I couldn't put a name to it. At that moment, Jean Lauscher's son walked in. A middle-aged man, looking different from the family photo in her home. I waved, and he nodded, walking over with a noticeable waddle. He was burly and coarse, and his first words were, "I don't know what dirty tricks you used to get her to sign that will, but you should know that my mom's house rightfully belongs to me. If anyone tries to take it, I won't mind going down with the ship." I didn't respond, just crossed my arms and watched him. Thinking his intimidation was working, he softened his tone, trying to sweeten the deal. "You can understand, right? I grew up in that house. I have feelings for it. I know my mom left it to you because you took care of her. So, how about this? I'll give you 5,000 yuan to thank you for looking after her. Just give up the house. Deal." I smiled. I wouldn't dare take such a huge amount, but if you really want the house, you can buy it back at market price. The man froze, then slammed his hand on the table. "Don't be ungrateful. My mom must have been senile to leave the house to you. I've seen your kind before, tricksters who sell fake medicine and call everyone mom to scam them. Why the hell did she leave the house to you? I was the one taking care of her, cleaning her filth. I suffered by her bedside, and you benefit? That's fucking unfair." My face turned cold. "You took care of her so well that she was covered in bed sores, maggots infesting her body, lying in her own waste, surviving on a respirator while you were enjoying yourself at the mahjong parlor with her pension. What kind of scum are you to talk about fairness?" The growing number of onlookers made the man furious. He roared and threw a punch at me. Caught off guard, I was knocked to the ground. Still enraged, he grabbed my collar and punched me in the stomach. The sudden pain sapped my strength. I tried to fight back, but only managed to struggle feebly as his punches rained down. Then, suddenly, the blows stopped and the hand gripping my collar let go. I collapsed on the floor, struggling to sit up, and saw the barista wrestling with the man. The scuffle ended with the sound of sirens. After opting for an out-of-court settlement, all that was left was to sign the papers and leave. When the barista signed, I sneaked a look. Cheng Shunhai. I hadn't noticed before, but now I saw the red mole on his cheek. I was taken aback. It was my long-lost cousin. But I had secretly followed my aunt's short video account and remembered that Cheng Shunhai had impressive academic credentials. How did he end up working in a cafe? Outside the police station, I was about to ask him when he spoke first. I thought the police would contact family to bail people out like in TV shows. I was scared to death. If my mom came, I'd be in big trouble. Seeing his relieved expression, I laughed. You saved someone, Shunhai. Aunt wouldn't scold you for that. No. I'm worried because I quit my job without telling her. If she saw me in this uniform, she'd know. We reached the bus stop, and Cheng Shunhai checked his watch. The last bus has left. Gah, I rent a place nearby. Why don't you stay over tonight? I declined, saying I'd take a taxi, but he insisted, dragging me along, saying we should catch up after all these years. All the way, Cheng Shunhai never stopped talking. He was just as talkative as he was in childhood, but something seemed different. Back then, his smiles came from the heart. Now, they felt like a mask, etched with a pretense of happiness. He kept asking about my situation, yet he ignored my questions about his own life. It was odd, but I answered anyway. I was laid off recently. Job hunting hasn't been easy. I'm thinking of taking a part-time job while preparing for the civil service exam. Civil service exam? Why jump into such a crowded field? Isn't every job crowded now? Besides, the civil service exam is fair. He laughed. You still care about fairness, huh? Hey, do you remember that time you grabbed me by the neck? Recalling the past made me uncomfortable, so I quickly changed the topic. And you? What do you care about now? I thought Cheng Shunhai would dodge the question again, but he hesitated before saying, right now, He was interrupted by a sharp female voice. The smile on his face vanished instantly, replaced by a rigid expression. He turned stiffly toward the voice. Mom, what are you doing here? I looked at the woman standing in front of the apartment complex. It was my aunt. Time had been kind to her. Her face hadn't changed much, and her posture remained upright. She still exuded an air of efficiency and strength. If I hadn't come, I wouldn't know you quit your job and are now serving coffee and cleaning tables. Cheng Shunhai sighed. Mom, it's late. Let's not disturb the neighbors. We can talk tomorrow. Oh, now you're embarrassed? I worked hard to raise you and put you through graduate school, and you throw it all away to be a waiter without shame? If your Aunt Wang hadn't called me, I'd still be in the dark. You're really something, Cheng Shunhai. You think you can do whatever you want. I spoke with your Aunt Wang. She said you can return to work on Monday. This resignation nonsense ends now. I'm not going back. I'm happy working at the cafe. I don't want to return. Just thinking about that job makes me want to die. Stop with the die nonsense. Who is happy at work? Everyone manages, so why can't you? And you should be grateful. The HR manager is my classmate. She looked out for you. If it were someone else. At this, the previously calm Cheng Shunhai exploded. Looked out? She never gave me any special treatment. All she did was make everyone at the company think I was a nepotism hire. Mom, do you know how suffocating those years at work were? Colleagues excluded me. The overtime was brutal, and proposals I spent nights working on were credited to others. None of that matters now. The worst part is, I don't even know what the point of all those late-night PPTs was. What was the purpose of that job? I don't know how others deal with such things, but these things happen to me. I'm me, not someone else. And I find it unbearable. My aunt cut him off, shouting, What nonsense are you talking about? You should be thinking about your stable future, settling down, starting a family. You're almost 28, not a 15-year-old high schooler. Stop whining about pain. Do you think any girl will want you as a waiter? What about when you're old with no pension, no children, lying in bed waiting to die? Their argument was intense. I stepped in to mediate, and my aunt noticed me for the first time. She glanced at me and frowned. Don't call me aunt. You haven't come home or called in years. I don't consider myself your aunt. She harshly shook off my hand and turned back to berate Cheng Shunhai, but she saw his tear-streaked face and heard his weary plea. Mom, I'm not like you. I can't look that far ahead. I don't want to endure present suffering for a distant future. I just want to live in the moment, to feel true happiness now. Mom, you always say you want the best for me, but the decisions you make for me only give you face. I'm not doing well. Not at all. Silence followed his words. My aunt took a deep breath, her brows furrowed. Fine. It's all my fault. Your suffering is all because of me. She shot a final glare at Cheng Shunhai and left. Cheng Shunhai stood motionless. I tried to comfort him, and he suddenly spoke out. Right now, I don't care about anything anymore. I just want to go to the park on Monday afternoon and see the crabapple blossoms. I didn't understand. He suddenly smiled, as if nothing had happened, and asked, Go. You said you were looking for a part-time job? Our cafe is hiring. Want to join? He turned to me, the dried tears on his mask-like smile, and those eyes, they were familiar. Filled with despair, like the cold, lonely depths of the ocean. Yet the faint light within them seemed like a plea. I couldn't recall where I'd seen such eyes before, but the familiarity made my heart race, like the eerie calm before a storm. I agreed to work part-time at the cafe. On Wednesday afternoon, Cheng Shunhai met me at the subway station. He looked exhausted, his face gray and devoid even of the mask-like smile from our last meeting. As we approached the cafe, I understood the reason for his change. My aunt stood in the cold wind, equally exhausted and expressionless, yet stubbornly upright, as if engaged in a silent standoff. After my interview, I ordered a hot latte at the counter. Stepping out, I saw my aunt still standing outside, stomping her feet against the cold. I hesitated, wondering if I should give her the latte, but she noticed me first and waved me over. I guessed she wanted me to persuade Cheng Shunhai to return to his job. But as I approached, she spoke first. Why are you so thin? Not eating properly again? Have you been doing poorly all these years? Why are you working at a cafe? Her simple questions made my nose tingle with emotion. I cleared my throat to dispel the lump and talked about my part-time job and preparing for the civil service exam. Hearing this, my aunt's expression brightened. That's great. But no matter how busy or tired you are, you must eat well. Your health is the most important. What I said the other day was out of anger. I've been worried about you all these years, wanting to call but fearing you were busy. If you have time, come home. I'll make braised pork for you, okay? I nodded and handed her the latte, ready to leave, but remembered the look in Cheng Shunhai's eyes that night. Hesitating, I turned back. Auntie, Cheng Shunhai is an adult now. Some decisions he should make for himself. Impossible. I can't just watch him ruin his life. Ignoring me, she took the latte and resumed stomping her feet. The next day, I started my job at the cafe. While working, I often saw my aunt's solitary figure through the window, standing in the cold wind, exuding a suffocating pressure. Cheng Shunhai became more and more silent, his brows knit tighter with each passing day. Finally, one afternoon when only he and I were on duty, he brought our aunt into the cafe. Cheng Shunhai spoke first. What do you want? Auntie replied, You know what I want. I want you to have a proper job with a future. Surprisingly, Cheng Shunhai didn't argue. He asked calmly, That's all? If I do that, will you promise to stop standing in the cold every day? Auntie, taken aback, nodded. Cheng Shunhai pulled out his phone and dialed a number. He seemed unnervingly calm, but as the call connected, tears began to fall unexpectedly. It was a disjointed scene. Cheng Shunhai's voice was exceptionally steady, pleading for forgiveness and begging for a chance to return to work in a deliberately humble tone. But his hand trembled, and his tears fell more fiercely, as if he would drown in them. For the first time, confusion crossed Auntie's face. She watched his tears fall, trying to reach out, but Cheng Shunhai dodged her touch. I'll report to work next Monday. Are you satisfied? Without waiting for an answer, he retreated to the storeroom. I asked, Are you really going back? His tears continued to fall, like beads from a broken string, staining the front of his black jacket. I can't bear to see her suffer in the cold. Now I just hope something, anything, will happen to stop Monday from coming, even if it's. Chung Shunhai stopped speaking. He gave me one last look before striding out the door. His last look lingered in my mind, and suddenly I understood why his eyes seemed familiar. They were like Qin Laosher's eyes. But unlike Qin Laosher's plea for release and death, Chung Shuanhai's eyes pleaded for help, a desperate desire to keep living despite the helplessness. He had been crying for help, trying to save himself all along. My heart sank. I rushed out the door, just in time to see Chung Shuanhai's body flying through the air after being hit by a car. In the ER, sitting next to my upright aunt, I blurted out my guilt and anger. Do you know he has depression? Do you know his last words before leaving the cafe? He hoped something, anything, would stop Monday from coming, even if. I completed Chung Shuanhai's unfinished thought, even if it was death. My aunt's posture collapsed. Her head, always held high, drooped, her lips trembling like a candle in the wind. Chung Shuanhai survived. I bought a recliner and stayed by his side day and night, to care for him and to prevent him from doing anything foolish. Auntie came every day, but she never spoke. She always sat quietly, occasionally playing with her phone. I couldn't help but sneak a peek at her phone once, and I saw that she was searching for terms related to depression. It was on that night when I couldn't sleep and woke up from a dream due to some noise in the ward. Through the hazy moonlight, I saw Auntie, who had knocked over the bedpan and was carefully stabilizing it before checking if we were asleep. I felt puzzled. With me accompanying Chung Shuanhai, Auntie would have gone home long ago. Why was she returning in the middle of the night? Driven by intense curiosity, I pretended to be asleep and quietly observed Auntie's movements. She stood still for a while, probably waiting for her eyes to adjust to the dim light. Then she walked slowly to the bedside, gently stroked Chung Shuanhai's hair, and slowly knelt down by the bed. Auntie curled up on the floor, hidden by the bed, with only her hands clasped at the pillow. Her voice sounded softly in the moonlight, calling upon gods from both the east and the west, chanting like a prayer and a confession. It's my greed, my desires, that have caused him to become like this. It's all my fault. Punish me if you must. I beg you, whoever you are, I've lived for over 50 years, long enough. Please take my life and let my son be safe and happy forever. She knelt on the ground and knocked her head 3 times, ending this absurd prayer. I remembered that Auntie was an atheist. She once likened religious beliefs to feudal superstitions, yet here she was, kneeling devoutly in the moonlight, praying to every god she knew for Chung Shuanhai's safety and happiness. My heart ached with bitterness, and I clenched the corner of the bedsheet, waiting for Auntie to leave shakily. It was then that I realized this feeling was jealousy. Chung Shuanhai's cries echoed in my ears, growing louder and more hoarse until they finally faded away. It was at this moment that I finally understood. I had never yearned for fairness my whole life. But I didn't have a mother who would kneel under the moonlight and pray for my safety. All I had was the pale, lifeless body that floated before my eyes. After Chung Shuanhai was discharged from the hospital, he went to see a psychologist. With Auntie's support, he decided to work as a water delivery worker like his uncle until he found a job he truly wanted. I mimicked the action of carrying water on my shoulders and asked him if he could handle the intensity. He smiled brightly. Carrying the water bucket on my shoulders is just a little pressure and pain. I can totally handle it. As we walked out of the counseling room, Chung Shuanhai was about to push the door when I stopped him and said, "I'm sorry. Sorry for the bruise I left on his neck 14 years ago, and sorry for the promise I couldn't fulfill 11 years ago." Chung Shuanhai didn't understand, and without explanation, I waved goodbye with a smile. After selling the house left by teacher Qin, I devoted myself to preparing for the exam. After passing the written test, I enrolled in an offline interview training course and successfully passed the interview. During the medical examination, Chung Shuanhai was more worried than I was. But with a regular lifestyle and no underlying health issues, I didn't receive any phone calls indicating that I had failed the medical. Chung Shuanhai called me on video, his face full of joy. "Great. No news is good news. Now all you have to do is prepare for the political review." From off-screen, Auntie's voice could be heard. Ask your brother if he's coming home for his birthday next month? And about the political review. Because of the tens of thousands of yuan missing in 2008, there was still a rift between us. I was afraid that if Ching Shunhai asked, my hastily concocted excuses would sound too lame, so I pretended to be busy and hung up the video call. Relieved after ending the call, my phone received another WeChat message from Ching Shunhai. Bro, my mom said uncle is a dishonest person who failed to fulfill legal obligations. Will this affect your political review? Uncle? It took me a moment to realize he was talking about my dad. A man who abandoned me and my mother early on, who I hadn't seen in over 20 years. Could he really have a negative impact on my job? It seemed ridiculous. But I was about to turn 34, and I had finally made progress. If he really did affect me, it would mean starting over in my life because of a scumbag who abandoned me. How could I accept that? With a heavy heart, I searched various related terms on my computer, but the opinions online were divided. Some said it would have a significant impact, while others said only judicial positions would be affected. I turned off the computer, feeling a headache coming on. The money my father swallowed, I never enjoyed a single cent of it, and I endured countless beatings for him. Now, just because he's my father, am I supposed to be implicated by him? Ching Shunhai sent another WeChat message, a string of addresses. I checked. Dishonesty probably won't affect you, but should we still confirm his current situation? That is, whether he's in prison? I agreed to go to the addresses to check, but the ominous feeling in my heart was too strong, so I refused Ching Shunhai's request to accompany me. I went alone and was led to a mahjong parlor at the address. Originally, I just wanted to take a quick look and leave, but the person had already shouted loudly, "Old fan, look who's here." The tall, unkempt man looked over impatiently, and behind him, voices grew louder. "Your son. Don't you recognize him?" Old fan frowned, scrutinizing me up and down, his eyes gleaming with malice. He shuffled over in his slippers. "My son? Fangency." After nodding, I finally understood why the person who brought me here was so excited. Father's debt should be repaid. It's only fair. With that, his hand stretched out flat in front of me. I was forced to give him back 3,000 yuan and was dragged by Old Fan into a store to buy a whole pack of soft Zhonghua cigarettes. He grinned, revealing yellow teeth, as he led me to his dirty and messy home. Feeling impatient, I wanted to leave, but he suddenly chuckled. "When your aunt threw the money I gave you back in my face, I thought you had the guts to break off our father-son relationship." His words left me stunned. "Money? The money you gave me back then, Auntie returned it to you." He flicked some ash and spat. "That crazy woman inexplicably came over, shouting that since you lived in her house, she raised you, and you were her real son. She told me to stay away from you. She wanted a cheap son, but now you're coming to your real old man for help." The rising frustration in my heart made me miss the latter part of his words. Turning abruptly, I strode towards the door, pulling out my phone to text Auntie. "Auntie, can we have dinner together tomorrow?" As I reached for the doorknob, I heard a voice behind me. "Oh, by the way, in 2008 when I went back, I heard your mom became a prostitute to repay my debt and then jumped into the river to commit suicide?" My steps faltered. Why bother? That group of scum hated me to death on the surface, but when I invited them to take a bath and have a meal, they wagged their tails like a bunch of dogs, calling me Brother Fan. Them calling him Brother Fan? I was baffled. The group of people who incited their own children to vent their anger on 12-year-old me uttered disdainful words that forced my mother to jump into the river, but now they were calling the instigator Brother Fan? I turned my head back to look at him, his legs crossed, his greasy expression making me nauseous. But your mom was always pretty stupid. Back then, I just pretended to be a hero, and she eagerly followed me home, saying she was going to bandage my wounds, but in reality, she just wanted to flirt. I know your mom inside and out. And what's she saying? Selling herself to repay my debt. Ooh, pure bullshit. She just had a sex addiction and was happy to be a bus. The last 3 words he spat out were like nuclear bombs, exploding fiercely in my ears. I knew Old Fan was scum, but He had left behind memories of waiting for me under the willow tree after school and secretly giving me snacks behind my mother's back. I thought he was just not good enough, but not necessarily bad. So, I stood there stupidly, unable to believe he would use such filthy words to describe my mother, who had shouldered everything for him after he ran away. "What did you say?" He grunted as if the words he had just said were just a puff of smoke. He tilted his head and thought for a moment before laughing. "Bus? You like hearing this, you little rascal. Are you going to be just like your mom?" My body was faster than my brain. When I realized it, I was already pressing down on Old Fan, fiercely punching his foul-smelling mouth. He spat out blood, losing 3 teeth in the process, and viciously cursed me before kicking me in the stomach with his knee. We wrestled together, his strength overpowering mine. My chances of fighting back grew slimmer, and I could only bite randomly, refusing to let go. He cursed and screamed, grabbing an ashtray from somewhere and smashing it down on my body and the back of my head. In pain, I loosened my grip, and he kicked me away, swearing and walking towards the kitchen with a murderous intent. "Today, I'll chop you into pieces." I heard the sound of knives colliding, but I felt no fear, only indescribable anger. I struggled to turn over, but the pain in the back of my head made it impossible to control my body. Footsteps came from the direction of the kitchen, and everything suddenly seemed so distant and silent. My head finally left the ground, and the world began to spin. Everything seemed to twist and collapse around me, enveloping me in a surreal world as if I were trapped in endless time, waiting for the inevitable arrival of death. The crisp sound from afar shattered the chaos around me, and everything gradually returned to normal. Following the sound, I discovered it was a text message reply from my phone. Was it Auntie's reply? My phone was tossed under the windowsill, the cracked screen reflecting light making it impossible for me to read the content clearly. Yet, I kept tilting my head to look, as if gazing at a hope that was within reach. Old Fan's curses brought me back to reality, and I turned to see him, his face contorted with rage, raising his arm high. Following his arm upward, I broke out in a cold sweat. Was that an axe? The axe, glinting with a cold light, swung towards me, and instinct for survival made me roll to the side. My reaction was fast, but the axe still grazed the flesh of my ankle, drawing blood. Blood mixed with dust pushed me under the table, and like a bowling ball, I knocked down a row of beer bottles. The table gradually overturned, and I grabbed a beer bottle, smashing it on the ground, then reversed my wrist and stabbed the broken bottle fiercely towards Old Fan's exposed foot. He screamed and stepped back, and I crawled towards him, repeatedly stabbing at his feet and shins. Finally, I crawled out from under the table and, just before he raised the axe, plunged it into his thigh. Old Fan screamed in pain, and I took advantage of the opportunity to drag my heavy body up and snatch the axe from his hand. I bit into his wrist, causing the axe to slip from his grip and fall under the table. Old Fan howled and struck my head with his elbow, causing me to stagger as he crawled towards the table. If he got hold of the axe, I was as good as dead. That thought drove me to muster all my strength. His hand was firmly gripping the axe handle, but I continued to crawl forward, and at that moment, I touched the charging cable that had fallen from the table. With almost no hesitation, I wrapped the charging cable around Old Fan's neck and tightened it fiercely. If he didn't die, I would. Grasping both ends of the charging cable, I could feel Old Fan's life slipping away. As his life ebbed away, amidst the chaos in my mind, the image of Auntie's smiling face suddenly appeared. Old Fan deserved his fate, but if I killed him, I would become a murderer. Locked in a cold prison cell, would I see disappointment in Auntie's eyes through the iron bars? No, absolutely not. I let go, and the charging cable hung limply, but the person in front of me remained motionless. Was he dead? Trembling, I leaned close to his chest, and after a long silence, I heard a slow, faint heartbeat, followed by raspy gasps emanating from Old Fan's lips. Relieved, I remembered to call for emergency help. I picked up my phone, and the first thing that caught my eye on the screen was Auntie's text message reply. "Okay, waiting for you to come home." Holding the phone, I stared blankly at the short 5 words, tears streaming down my face uncontrollably. The love that I thought I could only yearn for all my life was now so easily obtained. My mother's lifeless body sinking to the bottom of the river, and the anger that once consumed me no longer had power over me. I felt a profound peace in my heart, and what grew within me was a hope that could not be destroyed by any force. I didn't know if old Fan would survive, or what I would face after calling the police. But no matter what, I think I'm going home.